Hi, everybody. Okay, so my name is Toby, and I teach in the Business Administration and Commerce departments at Vanier College. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 32nd Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide at Vanier College. Before we start the presentation, we'd like to thank our honorary chair, Rabbi Yehuda Sarna, as well as our partners, the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation and the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We also thank the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the Vanier College Teachers Association for their support. We give deep gratitude to the college for financial and logistical support, and especially the Office of the Faculty of Arts, Business, and Social Sciences, the Communications Department, and the Director General's Office. Today's speaker is Matthias Becker, giving a talk entitled Analyzing Online Antisemitism. Dr. Becker leads the international research project Decoding Antisemitism at Technische Universität Berlin. Using a mixed methods approach that also incorporates AI-based methods, 22 researchers analyze antisemitism in mainstream discourse online in Germany, France, and in the UK. Matthias studied linguistics, philosophy, and literature at the Freie Universität Berlin and has worked with several research projects on the use of language in political and media campaigns at the Technische University. I hope I pronounced all of that correctly. You'll have to tell me. Dr. Becker is speaking over Zoom. Those participating through Zoom are automatically muted, but can ask questions using the Q&A function, and I'll moderate that. We ask that attendees in the auditorium turn phone ringers off and keep noise to a minimum so that all participants, including those on Zoom, can benefit from the talk. Thank you for being with us, Matthias.
Yes, Toby, thank you so much for having me and for this warm introduction. I hope you can hear me okay. Let me just share my slides with you. Okay.
Matthias, I'm not sure if you're hearing me, but we just have a technical glitch on our end where you're coming up very quietly. Just give us a second to fix the volume.
Okay.
Okay, I think we hear you now. Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so thanks again for this warm introduction and for having me now like a second time at the Vanier Symposium. I'm truly honored to be able to share my results, our project results with you. And as Toby just mentioned, I'm the lead of the Decoding Antisemitism project in Berlin, Paris, and London. It's a transnational project on Jew hatred online. My background is cognitive linguistics, and for the past 12 years, more or less, I've been particularly interested in studying coded language, coded hate speech, and anti-Semitism first and foremost. So in this presentation, I'll explore the topic of Jew hatred on social media, focusing on October 7th and its impact on online culture. However, before delving into that specific topic, I'd like to speak about two things. First, I'd like to address the various challenges associated with researching antisemitism in the realm of social media. This is definitely a challenging endeavor due to all these specifics and all these, factors that you need to consider if you want to have reliable results. And then my second part, I would quickly elucidate our methodology within the Decoding Antisemitism project, providing insights into how we navigate this kind of complex landscape. And after these short sections, I then get to the topic of October 7th within the realm of digital discourse. I think the first two parts are important in order to contextualize our findings, particularly in the last 6 months. Just to bear in mind, it is crucial to acknowledge that my exploration will only scratch the surface. Antisemitism is a hate ideology with a history spanning 2 millennia. It has evolved and adapted across various historical phases. And this adaptive nature means that antisemitism manifests in myriad forms across political, social, and of course, cultural domains, including the online sphere. So attempting to capture this complexity within a talk like today is barely possible. So please consider this presentation as a preliminary foray into this intricate subject. And if you want to have a more comprehensive understanding, I urge you to delve into the extensive publications of our research project, in particular, our last discourse report that came out a few weeks ago, which offer in-depth analysis of antisemitism after October 7th, but also there are also various other case studies presented there. So you can just download these on our website or just Google Decoding Antisemitism, or on the following slides, you will also see, like right now, a QR code that will lead you directly to the publication. So let's get to the challenges I mentioned before and associated with detecting and then tackling antisemitism online. So first of all, it involves understanding the various building blocks or concepts / stereotypes associated with antisemitism. As I mentioned, antisemitism is a hate ideology which is roughly 2,000 years old. The researcher Robert Wistrich once called it the longest hatred in human history. And it is remarkable, as I said, that it adapted itself to the conditions around it since its existence. And that's why in research, but also in public discourse, people very often use the metaphor of a chameleon. Depending on the zeitgeist, depending on attitudes about what represents the good and what stands for the evil, antisemitism has always been able to realign itself, and always with the basic concept that Jews are the others, that they don't belong to the in-group. And subsequently, all other stereotypes are built on this kind of idea, right? So you have this kind of construction of difference, and over time, various other stereotypes were added, Jews being presented as the evil, greedy, that they represent power. Conspiracy theories came up, but also historical analogies between, when it comes to Israel-related antisemitism and European atrocities in the past. This is something that I will mention a little bit later in my talk. So, and what happens in the process is if you want to use a psychoanalytical term, it is kind of a projection of all those qualities that are evaluated in a negative way that people want to get rid of. So Jews are seen as the absolute and total negation of the world order defined as normal and good. So it's always depending to look at the respective historical phase on the speaker's self-image, what constitutes their concepts of like themselves, and against that, or juxtaposed with that, the concept of the Jew. And based on that kind of history, like ideological history of antisemitism, in anti-Semitism studies, we can identify 4 main trends or main forms of antisemitism. Well, the first and foremost, of course, Christian anti-Judaism, resulting from the 2 competing religions in the Mediterranean region, between the then still young Christianity and Judaism as its father religion. And of course, here Jews were presented as murderers of God. And according to that, over time, everything a Christian should be, like what are actually the positive aspects of like a Christian character, all the positive character traits such as being kind, altruistic, feeling love for one's neighbor, etc., were just used in order to negatively define the Jewish outgroup. So Jew is presented as evil, bloodthirsty, vengeful, greedy, infidel, hypocritical, deceitful, etc. And that's, of course, some time ago when we talk about the Middle Ages. But when you bear in mind that the church was the institution for more than 1,700 years, you can understand how relevant it is, even for the following phases in a European history in particular. Afterwards, we talk about racist antisemitism, when religion could no longer serve as a framework for interpreting the world. And here Jews presented a racially determined like negative value. It's not anymore, there's not anymore the option that Jews could convert to Christianity. It's actually a racially determined and formed repertoire of negative traits of character, plus the idea that Jews were portrayed as conspirators, as sources for disintegration. You have to bear in mind that in the 18th and 19th century, the idea of the nation state came up, and again, the way how people defined themselves was really really much framed by these young ideologies, and therefore Jews as the other were portrayed as those forces, internal enemies that made this kind of national in-group or kind of national identity impossible. After 1945, we talk about secondary anti-Semitism, when anti-Semitism transformed or mutated again. Old stereotypes where changing greed and immorality, for instance, became the idea that Jews exploit the Holocaust. There's something that's called communication latency that I will refer to in a second. You have a lot of implicit forms, a lot of coded forms. There's not anymore much talk about the Jews, but about the lobby, about the globalists, etc. That, of course, can become, under certain circumstances, placeholders for the Jewish outgroup. And of course, particularly when we talk about Germany and Austria, to some extent, also Italy, there was a clear rejection of collective guilt. There's a request for a clean break and exoneration that is also connected to this kind of secondary anti-Semitism, again, with the idea that if the German in-group, the German national in-group wants to feel something like national pride, it's again the Jew that makes it impossible, Jews as admonishers, etc. And the last form would be, of course, Israel-related anti-Semitism, with the rule of thumb that under this particular form, which is, of course, in various contexts also strongly discussed, how to define it. The rule of thumb would be every stereotype that we could see in the history of anti-Semitism are projected onto the Jewish state. So this is kind of a pretty good approach to this, that actually in a statement in the past where Jews were actually portrayed as being evil, the evil of the world, that they control governments or the media, just the word Jew is replaced by a word referring to the Israeli outgroup. So there you can see a certain similarity. Again, this is context sensitive. This is something we will also talk about in a second. So this is this explains also the idea of that is presented here, Leon Polyakov's quote, Israel as the Jew among the nations. So again, projections of all classical and modern era stereotypes onto the Jewish state. And these four forms already show or prove how adaptable anti-Semitism is. And it's definitely something when you think of the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism, I would argue that it would be distortive if we categorize anti-Semitism as a subform of racism, because there are definitely certain aspects that you cannot find within the realm of racism. If you just think of a visual metaphor, the racist looks downwards to a group of people that they define as being inferior. Of course, you have the same phenomenon when it comes to anti-Semitism, when you just think of a Nazi propaganda, but it just doesn't end there. You have the idea of, the anti-Semite also looks up because they are scared of a lobby, of a powerful elite that controls the media, that controls nation states. So it's actually going in two directions. That's why you can find anti-Semitism on the right and on the left. It's not only connected to the emotion of hate. It's also connected to emotions of fear, which is also a pretty good explanation, psychological explanation, why anti-Semitism, the Weimar Republic in Germany, was so successful. Okay, so this is just what I just referred to. It's just the content-related aspect of anti-Semitism. It's getting more complicated when we talk about the form or the communication, the pattern through which those stereotypes are communicated. This is very often something that anti-Semitism studies didn't take into account to a full extent. And of course, the third challenge is the interactive web. It's not we don't talk about anymore about these top-down processes that, for instance, a conservative politician in Paris in the 19th century shared anti-Semitic ideas, and people started believing in those kind of myths. Or the same holds true, of course, with journalists. All sorts like really anti-Semitic talk, anti-Semitic ideas spread by the elites on the media level. This is, of course, still the case when you think of certain states today. But But of course, with the interactive web, we have the phenomenon that we see bottom-up processes. You have various authors, you have various ideas about Jews, what they do, what they would do, how they would behave. And so based on that, due to the fact that we have various authors, you just have a myriad of anti-Semitic speech acts out there. Plus, you have communication conditions like anonymity, you have mutual reinforcement between web users, which of course leads to a radicalization in language use and communication in general, and slowly but constantly also a normalization of hate speech. And given the amount of ways to communicate those ideas, it is very difficult to track that down. And getting back to the second challenge, because I'm a linguist, let me just dive quickly into the issues that we are facing with regard to communication. Explicit anti-Semitism, I guess, is quite clear what it means. You have a clear reference to Jews. You have a clear reference to a stereotype, for instance, all Jews are greedy, for instance, or you have slurs. So actually a one-to-one relationship between the idea of Jews and the applied language. Implicit anti-Semitism, however, is a little bit more, or depending on the level, quite tricky, because the concept is that you don't have this kind of one-to-one relationship anymore. You have the idea that you can reconstruct to some extent based on a coded language. At the level of code or implicitness needs to be distinguished here. You have innovative speech in various forms, and you need different sources of knowledge in order to extrapolate the hidden meaning. To give you just a few examples, this is just a tiny extract of what I call implicitness. So in our project, also years ago, I tried to operationalize implicit anti-Semitic hate speech, really starting with semiotic markers, the three parentheses, quite famous, white supremacy convention, placing Jewish names, and everybody understand that these names refer to Jewish individuals. You have, of course, the phenomenon of icons, also currently the watermelon, the paraglider. So this is rather basic. It gets more complicated when we talk about wordplay or puns, where actually the surface of the word is changed in order to communicate an anti-Semitic idea via kind of detour communication. A good example would be the reference to Spielberg's movie, Schindler's List, where you actually have on the one hand the reference to the name Schindler, but of course with some changes, there's a reference to swindle, lie, and the second word list in German stands also for cunning or trickery. So you have actually two anti-Semitic tropes expressed in one slogan or one pun. On the one hand, the denial of a Holocaust, that it is a swindle, and second, there's a trick, there's cunning behind it. So the idea that Jews exploit the Holocaust for financial gain. And people immediately understand it. You don't need to say it word by word, but people in your peer group, in your national community understand that concept immediately. With allusions, it's getting a little bit more complicated because the surface of the word is not changed, but like two scenarios are put together that don't really seem to fit. Like a good example would be, for instance, the Austrian artist was right, a reference to an allusion to Hitler, of course, or someone should give George Soros a shower in quotes. And of course, the word shower is an allusion to the gas chambers. And here you have a coded death wish. That also holds true for the fourth paragraph, implicit Nazi comparisons based on allusions with regard to Israel. And really tricky are indirect speech acts, like rhetorical questions, forms of irony, where actually on the level of the statement of the user comment, you don't have any explosive word. You don't have any reference to Jews. You don't have any reference to a stereotype. For instance, the first rhetorical question that you can see on that slide, put below the line of an article about the culture of memory in Germany, immediately everyone would understand that the idea here is that Jews exploit the Holocaust, again, for financial gain. And again, there's just no indicator directly word by word in the message. You need to have word knowledge, you need to have context knowledge, you need to understand the metaphor of holding out your hand, etc. We as human beings do that, but following just a quantitative approach would just make that impossible to detect. By now, I mean, until now. This will definitely change in the close future, but I will elaborate on that in a second. And this is just the verbal level, right? So just as I just said, you have one anti-Semitic concept, like in this case, a speech act called death wish. You can express that explicitly, like here. You can use puns in order to express exactly the same idea. Here, a reference to Kanye West, of course. I referred to the shower example already, and like the last part would be a rhetorical question that expresses exactly this genocidal idea when it comes to Israelis. And as soon as you can operationalize that and you have a proper sense of where the discourse is heading to, you can actually say something substantial, how prevailing, how present anti-Semitism actually is. But you need to take those forms into account, because as soon as you look into so-called mainstream discourse and you have a set of data and you classify, for instance, 20% of those comments as being anti-Semitic, among these 20%, it's definitely more than 80% of coded anti-Semitism that you can find. So those examples I just showed you definitely don't play a minor role when it comes to the assessment of anti-Semitism today. So this was the word level, the verbal level. The visual level is, of course, another challenge. Here you have a reference to the Happy Merchant, a quite well-known meme in order to refer to Jewish immorality and power and evilness. This is rather easy to find, but of course you can see that those forms also change. Yeah? That there's an update of that meme. With regard to Donald Trump, of course, you have a reference to COVID-19. You have a reference to Zelensky, of course. So this is rather prominent in those during these public or discourse events. When we talk about deepfakes, it's getting a little bit trickier. So here you can see examples on the left-hand side, the idea that Jews are behind mass immigration. On the right-hand side, on the top side here, you can see a reference to biblical allegories, the snake and the apple, and above the picture you can see the statement, only people of culture can see it. We actually understand, where people can understand, okay, you need to have historical cultural knowledge in order to understand one thing, that behind every evil you can find the Jew. Right? And those ideas are expressed in visual ways and immediately understood. In the middle, and I copied that picture and minimized it to some extent, there's the idea of the Jew responsible for the destruction of the white Western culture. And I copied that picture because sometimes people need to have a certain distance to see the similarity in the physiognomy. And you can see here how well equipped those people with anti-Semitic worldviews are, and how in what kind of creative, innovative way they express age-old ideas. Same is true, of course, with memes, the ideas of Jewish greed. You have the child murder, the control of American politics. You have the trivialization of terror in the middle, and the trivialization of terror and rape. And of course, ongoing the idea of Israel being the Nazi state, which is something that really stands in the foreground in anti-Semitism studies in continental Europe, given how distortive that kind of comparison is. So I'm showing you all these examples in order to just emphasize one idea, that anti-Semitism is nothing. It's not a simple hate ideology. It's very, very difficult to understand the full dimension of it. We just so far only see the tip of the iceberg, because what we do is very often just looking for slurs, or we just look for certain keywords, for instance, Zio-Nazis, or whatever your definition of anti-Semitism is, whatever concept you're interested in, very often people just think, okay, I look for the word, and there you go. You have a clear understanding where the discourse is heading. And this is just not how human beings interact. Human beings interact via, again, implicit, subtle ways. It's not only about content moderation. It is also about, sharing some secret knowledge that distinguish them from the stupid majority of society. That's a very important factor. That's why you find coded anti-Semitism not only in mainstream discourse, but also in fringe communities, also on Gab and 4chan. It actually tells people, what you're talking about, and you just share it with your peer group that is smart enough to see the problem. And that fact actually led to, or that observation, that we're actually at the beginning of assessing the real dimension. And this is not only true for anti-Semitism. When we talk about all sorts of also racism, misogyny, people just don't forget all the time that language is one of the most complicated systems we are surrounded with, and that's actually what gave me the idea for Decoding Antisemitism, right? An interdisciplinary project that actually allows bringing together people from different backgrounds. We have a 20-headed research team coming from racism studies, nationalism studies, from anti-Semitism studies, obviously, people like me, linguists, people who do discourse studies, image analysis, and of course, the field of data science. So far, when we look into web-related anti-Semitism studies, like the interdisciplinary aspect to it was very often very superficial, that, for instance, these scholars meet from time to time. But what I had in mind was bringing together those people under one roof and have an ongoing conversation of what anti-Semitism is, how it permeates, how it changes over time, what are the mutations, what are the verbal and visual expressions, and then to understand how this can be actually used for the training of large language models. And in contrast to most of our research projects that we know of, like when we think of, projects coming from the ADL or NCRI or the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, our project really starts with a qualitative analysis. So really looking into, we have, for instance, a discourse event like October 7th, or, Elon Musk shares a statement on X, or, an anti-Semitic incident on the streets of Paris, and then we have media coverage about that. And then we as researchers were interested in seeing what kind of response you can find in online communities that feel connected to that particular media outlet. And in detail, it looks like this. We use a tool that's called MaxQDA, comparable to Atlas TI, if you're aware of those programs. And you can see here on the left-hand side something called the code system, or it would be our annotation system, consisting in our case of 160 elements. Starting with, is this, is on the basis of ideation, anti-Semitic versus not anti-Semitic. Then the second section would be, what kind of stereotypes can we find? And the third question would be, what kind of communicative pattern comes up? And on the right-hand side, you see an extract of a comment section, and you see for every comment that we annotated on various levels. Always, is it anti-Semitic? If it's anti-Semitic, what kind of concept is it? And then again, what are the rhetoric devices to communicate those ideas? And this is extremely powerful because it tells you how, for instance, in Germany or in the UK, a certain anti-Semitic idea, and again, it holds true also for other hate ideologies, how a certain prejudice or stereotype gets normalized over time. Because maybe at the beginning of your measurement period, people just refer to that rather, in coded ways by, for instance, using irony or rhetorical questions. And over time, there's a certain normalization that people just don't see the necessity anymore to use elaborated rhetorical devices to express that idea. So far in the project, we analyzed 27 discourse events. We analyzed more than 130,000 user comments in that particular way. As you just saw, we looked into war in Ukraine. We looked at escalation phases in the Middle East. We looked into the David Miller case in the UK. Dieudonné in France. And it was kind of interesting. A consistent element to all these case studies was that if we had a contrastive analysis, like, for instance, war in Ukraine and how it triggered anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that the UK was very often on top. It was very often, the web community was quite approachable when it came to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, for instance, sometimes more than 20%. And Germany was just quite often on the other side. Like, it doesn't mean that there's no anti-Semitism in Germany. I'm just saying that it really depends on the discourse event you want to analyze. So it's not always the same event, the same incident that triggers a lot of anti-Semitism everywhere. It has to do with the cultural memory. It has to do what is actually what hurts people, what makes people angry, for instance. You know, I mentioned secondary anti-Semitism before. We had a couple of Holocaust court trials in the last 3 years in Germany. Again, like a media reports about the aspect that completely like normal, everyday Germans were participating in the mass murder of Jews. And this, of course, reminds people that actually the Holocaust is the biggest obstacle for national pride in Germany. And that triggers those forms, those incidents trigger a lot of anti-Semitism on the German side, because national pride and anti-Semitism are very often correlating. So, and this, of course, you cannot find on the French and the British side. There you can see very often an acceptance and tolerance and even what's an affirmation of conspiracy theories that are not that prominent on the German side. In order to translate all our observations from the web discourse, from our qualitative analysis into like options that people can actually use for their own work as researchers interested in hate speech on social media, we will soon, like in 2 or 3 weeks, we will publish that book, an open access book, where we actually present all the anti-Semitic concepts that we could find online consistently. So we have around 40 chapters that you can see here. Each chapter is dedicated to a stereotype. We have an historical overview. We give a short, brief definition of, you know, what anti-Semitism represents here. And then we have an empirical part with explicit examples, implicit examples, and then again, the topic of gray areas where we don't see enough information to classify that as anti-Semitic. And I think this can be really, really useful, not only for content moderators or for, you know, people working for social media platforms, but really for teachers, for university professors who want to deal with that topic, for people who very often think that there are no clear ways of identifying coded anti-Semitism or racism or whatever you're interested in. So that book can also be useful, again, for people who are interested in hate ideologies online in general and who want to use a pragmalinguistic approach to deconstruct the hidden concepts behind coded messaging. Last word about the project. It's a rather complex research design. I just mentioned step 1, the qualitative content analysis, 130,000 user comments that you can see on the left side here, step 1. We annotated a lot. It was very, very intense work. And over time, this material will then be used as training data for large language models, step 2 in the background. And here you have then the automated classification based on fine-tuning those large language models. And that then goes back to us and we evaluate that information, how accurate, how precise these large language models already work. And this kind of feedback loop is extremely crucial in order to avoid a high frequency of false positives and false negatives that we really try to keep alive, this ongoing conversation between the social scientists and the data scientists. Okay. Getting to finally to the real topic, Celebrating Terror was our first study that came out only 2 weeks after October 7th happened. So this was something, usually we just publish discourse reports every 6 months, but given the dimension of October 7th, we decided to just really start annotating as much as possible, particularly the like spontaneous reactions coming from from web users on October 7th and 8th, like before actually the Israeli retaliations started. And we wanted to see what is the main response coming from those web users. Again, we talk about mainstream discourse, right? We were mainly looking at YouTube and Facebook at that time. Then we opened up towards Instagram and later on also TikTok. So 11,000 user comments that we analyzed in detail. And what we could see, of course, was an extreme increase in anti-Semitism. Not surprisingly, like lots of civil society organizations refer to that. Sometimes even anti-Semitism tripled on the French side, but also and particularly on the British side. But this is just a frequency. And I think very often when we just read those headlines, anti-Semitism, there was an increase of anti-Semitism X%, it doesn't really explain much, because I think what makes such an analysis really relevant, of course, it is interesting to see what triggers anti-Semitism, but I think it would be more important to understand what kind of anti-Semitism we can identify and what was like the main difference to all the escalation phases and the response online, all these case studies we've done so far, but also me personally in the last 10 years. What really happened on October 7th was not only a higher frequency of anti-Semitic speech acts, but also the nature of anti-Semitism changed. It was a lot of so-called self-positioning, as I put it. So it's not so much about the demonization of Israel, you know, and of course, some of these forms of demonization don't really fall under anti-Semitism. They might be wrong, but we wouldn't code them as anti-Semitic. But of course, there were also demonizing statements that activated anti-Semitic tropes. This is kind of rather common. As soon as there's an escalation phase, there's a terror attack somewhere in Jerusalem, those stereotypes go up in online discourse. On October 7th last year, this didn't really happen. And what happened instead was an incredible amount of those forms of self-positioning, speech acts that openly say that the stuff we are seeing right now in that YouTube clip, we embrace that, we appreciate that, we glorify that. So there was even not the necessity of saying Israel is an apartheid state, or Israel represents the evil of the world, and therefore I hate Israelis, or therefore I hate Jews worldwide. There was not even that kind of justifying construct that you can find very often even online. But people didn't even use stereotypes anymore. They just went directly to those forms of overt hatred that in that dimension and that clarity I've never seen in previous years. So, and, you know, examples would be, again, primarily those open forms of affirmation. Also, when people see terror attacks, they see the Nova Festival, they see the Kibbutzim. There were lots of examples where people were expressing statements like Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea, statements that in other contexts we would not annotate as being anti-Semitic, because there's always, we follow this kind of conservative coding scheme. As soon as you have like 2 or 3 or 4 possible readings of the same statement, we would not annotate that as anti-Semitic, because there are various readings possible. But in that particular context, statements like that, their possible interpretation just went in one direction. And that was quite often, yeah, as I said, a clear affirmation of violence, a clear affirmation of that violence that we can see in those online statements. You can see also here, they deserve 60 years of this, not only one day, or a lot of Schadenfreude, a peaceful community must treat like this everywhere. And interestingly, something that I didn't find very often in mainstream discourse are intersections. Usually anti-Semitism and racism, or anti-Semitism and misogyny, are juxtaposed. They don't really overlap in those online values. But here we could definitely see a lot of misogynistic and anti-Semitic ideas expressed on a regular basis when it comes to the female festival goers. You know, she will be the guest of honor and stuff like this. Really, that goes kind of borderline towards even pornographic, dehumanizing statements, and always in connection with sarcasm, cynicism, schadenfreude, etc. There's also a clear affirmation of the Nazi atrocities. It's not anymore about Israel. You can see it in the first wordplay during the booth, where you can see who's actually meant here. Again, you have the reference to Hitler, the Austrian painter, and over time, something that reminded me of the discourse after 9/11, this kind of dichotomy between, Islam and the West, the Huntington's clash of civilizations that in itself causes various problems, I would say. But here it was promoted. It was actually said various times that Israel is just the first place where this will happen. Some concepts occur to a lower degree, like denial of Israel's right to exist and the justification of violence based on the idea that it was just Israel right from the start since 1948. But again, from their frequency, they were pretty low. What really stood out was the open affirmation. And of course, you can see also those references to paragliders that in that particular context have, of course, a clear meaning, because this was one of the first pictures we saw on that day. And here again, you can see affirmation expressed via visual or text image relations. And of course, deepfakes are involved as well, as you can see here. So this is just particularly in the sixth report that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. I will end soon, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. The sixth discourse report that came out mid of February, there we actually continued our research, and we looked into Instagram in more detail. We did a contrastive analysis, not only looking into Germany, France, and the UK, but also integrating more countries, 6 further countries, all the time looking at the immediate response coming from web users. We analyzed more than 25,000 user comments, and we did a contrastive analysis between May 2021, the last escalation phase, and October 23. And that was kind of insightful, because let me just show you that slide, this diagram. Here you can see the online response to May 2021, the first 2 to 3 days on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the response to October 2023. And you can see that in 2021, there was not a good balance, but a lot of stereotypes were standing out. And as I said before, the affirmation of violence, the last category presented in this diagram, is definitely on top of everything. And there are various explanations for that. Also, when we look into historical anti-Semitism, as soon as there was a pogrom in Eastern Europe, and there were reports on that, and people spoke about this, this very often led to more violence against Jews in other parts of Europe. So violence triggers more violence. And I guess in May 2021, of course, we didn't see that amount of violence and murder, which of course led to other stereotypes, and of course also the idea that that Israel controls the media and other concepts that actually stood out. But in October 2023, it was actually the first time when people could see maybe Israel won't survive. Maybe like also when Hezbollah gets involved, maybe Israel will be history. And that is something comparable to what we could see when it comes to historical forms of anti-Semitism in Europe, that now for the first time, I would argue, comes up in the realm of social media. Yes, so that's, I think, quite insightful. What we will do in the next months is to open up the amount of language communities that we want to look at. We will not only focus on Europe, we will definitely have a closer look with regard to US American and Canadian discourses. We want to look into the transatlantic dynamics when it comes to that kind of discourse. We would like to expand to further language communities. I just mentioned a couple of those. And we would like to train our AI models, not only on the level of language, of verbal patterns, but also visual and text image relations. That is so important as soon as we talk about Instagram or TikTok, of course. Audio visual elements will also be part of it. And I think it's not so important to tackle the problem right away. I think what is definitely missing right now is to understand how a trigger, a discourse event like October 7th, triggers different forms of Jew hatred, because the knowledge which we can get from social media will help us develop also a better and more profound dialogue in different offline contexts on the political level, but also on the educational level. Because otherwise, if we don't understand how anti-Semitism is expressed and shared online, there's just no way of having a profound dialogue and to develop really powerful counter strategies in this regard. So I would say it is really important for the future to develop better strategies on the level of, on the basis of results coming from social media studies, and to figure out at what point anti-Semitic imagery, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories start to grow and also start to trigger racist stereotypes, which is of course the case when we talk about the Great Replacement theory, right? So I think the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine is quite apt to understand the dimension of anti-Semitism and its potential impact on our society and democracy in the future. Okay, so far, I hope I didn't take too much time, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and your questions.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was pretty intense. Can we get his, instead of the slide back, can we see him? Sorry, we lost your face there for a minute. There we go. Okay, so I'll start by asking the people in the audience in person if they have any questions. Are there any questions here? Sometimes it takes the students a few minutes to think of their questions. So if I don't see any hands, I'll go to the online questions and then I'll come back to the room. So far, we have 2 questions online, and we may get more. The first one says, the watermelon represents the liberation of Palestine. Palestinians have been living under occupation for more than 70 years and are being bombed for months. So I don't understand how the watermelon can be anti-Semitism, since it doesn't refer to all Jews, but to the state of Israel, who is killing tens of thousands of Palestinians. I just want to be clear, this is not my opinion. This is the question online. So Matthias, maybe you can answer that specifically about the watermelon emoji or any related symbols and words. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. So I think what I tried to, and I think I referred to that particular icon in a too abbreviated form. I think it is important to, what I also tried to say with regard to Free Palestine and from the river to the sea, there's always the benefit of a doubt with regard to these open statements and also visual elements. I think it's important to look at when this statement actually comes up, when those symbols like that are actually shared, and the inference potential of those statements. I mean, those the ideas that can be triggered, that are kind of open, if you just state that in a more open way, not really connected to a specific event like October 7th, is just, if you follow conservative coding, is that, again, there are various interpretations possible, but as soon as that statement comes up as a direct reference, as a direct response to the crimes we saw on October 7th, there's just no other way. I mean, I would be very interested to see what kind of interpretation can be taken based on, the slaughter of people, and then showing the flag in a coded way or in an overt way in that particular context, because this is just a direct response. That's why we classified those statements in the verbal or in the visual way as being anti-Semitic, because they just say implicitly what's happening right now is just part of building or establishing a Palestinian state, which, following that argumentation, says that this state needs to be based on terrorist acts like that one. And this is definitely something I would argue crosses the line, crosses the threshold towards the, again, glorification of violence. But again, it is really depending on where do you place that statement. For instance, after the first days of that escalation phase, for our qualitative analysis, we took Free Palestine and From the River to the Sea out, because again, what was the message at that time was just a coded affirmation of what we could see on those YouTube clips or on Telegram. But as soon as the bombing of the Gaza Strip started, the message, of course, changes its meaning. And we as social scientists need to take that into account, because these are the signals that are shared on the media level and within society, and therefore meaning switches again. And so for the training of classifiers, if this is actually possible, I mentioned beforehand that the training of classifiers is still something that needs to happen in the future. Context knowledge is definitely something these models cannot really work with very well. Therefore, those parts would always be excluded from the AI part of our project. But for the qualitative analysis, and that, of course, was also true for right-wing populist discourse in all national contexts, would be that we need to measure, we need to understand the full dimension of a statement in the particular co-textual and contextual situation.
Thank you. The second question asks whether you have any thoughts on the efforts to label Jews as white settler colonists. I saw that was actually a chapter of the book that's coming out, so maybe you could speak a bit to that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it really also there, when we talk about historical analogies, I would say that in our research team, when we look at the guidebook we developed, all these historical analogies that in themselves actually don't really say much about the historical knowledge of people who present that as being the case, because there are definitely lots of studies about the real dimension of colonialism and apartheid. I would say in those contexts, it's again the amount of, or the dimension of how this is actually presented by the web user. Is it something that you would say is an inherent characteristic of Israel, of the mindset of Zionists, of the ideology of Zionism? Then I would argue it's highly distortive, and people should just really get back to the library and read a little bit more about that time. What is actually the driving force of colonialism at that time is a clear economic factor. Is we talk about colonial racism, the history of the Jewish people and the creation of a Jewish state follow other dynamics. I'm not saying that there are no racist trends within Israeli society. For sure, there are. The current government is a good example for that. There are also lots of similarities when we talk about colonialism and apartheid when it comes to the West Bank. But again, it is the question of generalization and essentialization. These are the two key terms that we very often use when it comes to historical analogies. Do people really think that the Jewish state is the last colonial endeavor? Is it the last, example of Nazism, of apartheid? I mean, again, this is so strongly distortive. And so really the facts, when you just read books from the British Empire and how these colonial entities were structured and what the main purpose was, this is definitely something that doesn't really, is not really equivalent to what is happening in the Middle East. So again, here it is important to distinguish between statements that generalize, that actually say that Israel just follows one agenda, or those examples that actually say there are fascist tendencies, there are colonial, there's a colonial mindset in certain political movements within Israel. And that would be, of course, legitimate criticism that I, to some extent, would even share. But like the main aspect, I think, of demonizing historical analogies is that people very often are not aware of that, but they trivialize, they distort the dimension of atrocities committed by European states, first and foremost, Germany, of course, with Nazism, but also all the atrocities committed during the colonial era. They are just trivialized in the context of those analogies, which in particular on the British and on the French side are highly problematic. I think I elaborated on that in a quite detailed fashion in my PhD. I wrote in 2021, Palgrave published a book, my book called Antisemitism in Reader Commons, and there I elaborated on that aspect of projection and the way how these demonizing analogies are actually a modern way of expressing hateful ideas without offering a critical debate, which is within Israel, but also outside Israel, highly necessary and more urgent than ever.
Before I go to the next online questions, perfect. I will come get my exercise for the day. Oh, you didn't have to do that. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question with regards to the title of the talk, as well as the way that I've read about your work and your team's work described in the media as an AI-driven study. I also read the most recent report, and in it, there's a significant amount of time that's spent talking about the really big challenges in using AI to study hate speech and imagery online. The fact that, because you keep talking about this issue of context, there needs to be context. We need to analyze these things within their context. And obviously in the last 6 months, there's been a significant discussion of the problems with talking about context and people wanting definitive answers. Well, one of the things, I'm an English teacher, one of the things that I really worry about with AI is that we're relying on it to provide us with definitive answers. But qualitative research gives some space for those kinds of interpretation that you've just been talking about. And I'm really concerned with the fact that when I read about your work in newspapers, etc., it made it seem like, here's the answer. Here's how we can figure out what is hate speech and what is not. And I'm really concerned with the fact that even in your publications, you're undermining that by saying, look, we really need to notice, even with some of the large language models like ChatGPT 3.5, we really need to be careful that we are not looking to these tools as being able to definitively tell us things, because they make mistakes. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because really the work that you're presenting, the way I read about it in newspapers, was very, very different than the way you're presenting it here. Okay,
that's super interesting. I would love to hear what newspaper articles you read, because so far we didn't have too much coverage. But yeah, maybe this can be answered later. Well, first of all, we do not rely on the large language models we have been training so far. It's not like okay, we now present a model that is powerful enough to answer all our questions with regard to anti-Semitism. I would say this is far from being perfect. And also, when you look into our discourse reports, maybe you mean that in the 5th report and the 6th report, we give clear insights of where the score, the F1 score of our large language models stand and what needs to be done. And again, we emphasized pretty clearly that it's just about the English data sets. So we don't even have a large language model for German or French because anti-Semitism there is even more complicated. So we just worked with the English data sets. And what we did there was only take those forms into account where you don't need co-text. Okay, so I now introduce another term. Co-text means the immediate surrounding environment of a word. And you, as a teacher, knows that. You know that, and therefore, these models are not even equipped to identify statements like, for instance, this guy is a liar, just look at his background. Well, you actually need to understand what this comment refers to what person that comment refers to. In the previous comment or in the body of the article or post, connecting these dots that we as human beings, as social beings, automatically do, these models cannot cover at the moment. And therefore, we are still at the beginning of just analyzing the whole amount of like one comment section of 2,000 comments to actually say in a reliable fashion that this is the amount of anti-Semitism. So we are far from being in that position of saying, here's our model, we can answer all these questions. With regard to the qualitative analysis, step one, we of course we have a definition of anti-Semitism that we use, and of course we have an operationalization based on definitions that seem suitable for us, but also that take into account the various ways of how people can express hateful ideas through rhetorical devices, and here it is absolutely necessary to have a rather clear taxonomy of the problem that we share throughout the team. So we did a lot of intercoder reliability tests, which means that on a regular basis, each of our colleagues annotated the same thread of 50 to 100 comments, and then we compared the results, and the overlap was very often above 85 to 90%, due to the training of all of us, that we actually had a clear understanding following conservative coding, again, based on pragmalinguistic, discourse analytical, and studies coming from anti-Semitism research, what the problem really is. Where does a statement actually in a specific context cross the line and activates an anti-Semitic image? And so there I mean, also when you look at the lexicon I just referred to in my talk, I would say, yeah, I mean, people don't need to share our understanding of anti-Semitism. It is our understanding based on our empirical work in combination of what we learned from anti-Semitism studies from history and how this hate ideology mutated over time. And this is, of course, a proposal. This is a suggestion how to approach that topic. It doesn't mean that we will answer all questions, but I think for this kind of detailed approach, we would quite like on a regular basis be able to say, okay, this comment is too vague. We can't do anything. It's not anti-Semitic. It's just too open to no, not too open, but too coded actually. Or there are certain words that come up on a regular basis that in this context, within this kind of language community, triggers those associations. And yeah, so I think the qualitative analysis is really led by the idea that we can identify it quite well. And the AI part is still really work in progress.
Okay, so I see another hand. Did I miss any? No. Okay. Sorry, Matthias, you can't see me here. I've got my head swiveling almost at 360. Okay. You had your hand up, right? Okay.
So first of all, thank you very much, Matthias, for your presentation. It was really, really interesting and powerful. You gave us a very different insight, different perspective on everything that's going on, especially online regarding anti-Semitism since October 7th. And I really appreciated that. But what I want to say is more comment. I don't know if it's really a question, but it's how the danger of coding and implicit anti-Semitism and how it's so powerful and it directly, it's something that almost everyone can superficially understand, but not deeply understand, like the comment and the impact of the tropes and the one-line statements that are coming out of this the anti-Semitism behind just these one-line statements. And it's been difficult. Like, how can you navigate such a powerful, they're very, very powerful statements. How can you navigate that? How can you argue it? Because everyone understands it in a way, like when they bring up just these powerful statements against Israel and what they're doing, what's happening in the Middle East. Yeah, which like it really has a deeper meaning, but just superficially people don't understand it. So it's just also the ambiguity of the comments, like you said, how they're too general sometimes to even analyze as being anti-Semitism or not. So yeah, just comment on that.
Okay, yeah, well, it's this is yeah. So the ambiguity of those statements. I mean, of course, I think the big problem that we are facing, you know, and I was interested in web-related anti-Semitism studies again in the last 10 years, and very often when I went to conferences, I was actually the only person who talked about hate speech and hate ideologies online. Also, when it comes to other disciplines like racism studies, etc., it was just not really a topic, and now people can see how relevant it is also for the developments in our society, because of course the social media are the most important platform for public debate and for political discourse, and it will shape the mindset of future generations, that's for sure. That's why we need to take it seriously. That's why we need to take it those forms in an overt or in a coded way very, very seriously, because it will impact the thinking and the attitudes, and therefore also the actions of many, many people. So I'm not saying that it's easy to identify those forms. I would also say that many research initiatives with regard to anti-Semitism and hate speech in general on social media struggle, because the annotations are very often done by non-experts. So you need to have a certain knowledge about the hate ideology. You need to understand the Middle East conflict. You need to understand, of course, you need to study history, but also applied linguistics to see how in the political realm, but also in public discourse, in media language, people apply certain strategies in order to communicate a hateful idea in an acceptable, in an accepted way, so that it doesn't really collide with the norms and rules within their space, within their peer group. So all that knowledge needs to be there in order to have like a solid annotation scheme and like results that are representative. I would just argue that for instance, for my team, we had an intense training phase of around 3 months at the beginning of the project. We had a lot of test data. We did a lot of like ongoing, we had a lot of discussions, as you can imagine. And but over time, there was a clear agreement that this is actually, okay, this is hate speech, this is anti-Semitism, this is the Middle East conflict. And it's not witchcraft, right? There are certain categories, there are certain aspects that will help you always to define it, you know, at least a certain frame of it. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no gray areas. I'm just arguing that the understanding in public discourse that, for instance, Israel-related anti-Semitism is something so vague that we cannot identify it, that it's too blurry, and it all has to do with criticism or something like that. This is just absolutely wrong. You have a whole body, like a whole research body about Israel-related anti-Semitism. And of course, there are within anti-Semitism studies, there are disagreements. And there are open, like harsh discussions at conferences. It's unbelievable what happens there from time to time. But in most of the cases, when it comes to stereotypes, also stereotypes projected onto the Jewish state, there's a clear agreement among those scholars. And I think social media studies and studies on history and discourse, they just need to go together. And based on that, we will have a good understanding. We will understand the way how current online discourse echoes certain forms of anti-Semitism of the 15th or 19th century, just in a slightly different way. But as soon as you have that knowledge, you can actually see how, based on the anonymity on social media, based on the mutual reinforcement between web users, how age-old tropes about Jews become normalized again. And you need to have that kind of diachronic perspective. Sorry, long answer, but I hope your questions were answered, at least to some extent.
So I want to be mindful of the time because students have their next class coming up. So I have another question in the room. If possible, maybe we can take that question and then thank you all. Some of them are already leaving. And then if you don't mind, maybe we could address some of the online ones after that, but just to sort of make sure that students have time to get to the next class. Especially, we actually even have a student on crutches I wish you could see. So we need to give everybody time. So we'll finish with this last question from the room.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, there was one slide when we were looking at hidden forms of anti-Semitism, and there was a photo that you showed with the Palestinian flag, and it said, "Stop calling it a conflict, it's literally a genocide." And I was just wondering, because obviously not all Jewish people around the world agree with what Israel is doing or are against it. And what if a Jewish person shares this opinion or says this? Because there are some that have like come out and called it a genocide, but I mean, you can't call that anti-Semitism, right? So like, I was just wondering, like, what are, you can call it?
Yeah. I mean, not in that, I'm not saying that example, but Jews can be anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's like, I was just wondering, like, how are Jews anti-Semitic, or like more about that? Like if a Jewish person agrees with this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. This is an important question because it touches upon the aspect of how we should approach those debates. I think very often we just lose a lot of time talking about the speaker itself, themselves. What's their background? For instance, in Germany, for a long time, people were saying that guy cannot be anti-Semitic because he's a left-winger. And you had the same debate in Britain with the Labour Party, and what we could see. Think of George Galloway or Jeremy Corbyn in Britain was highly explosive, also with regard to Jewish communities in the country. Statements that didn't have anything to do with Israel and the Mideast conflict and the tragic situation the Palestinians are in. So why I mention this is just the fact that very often we just lose ourselves in the question of identity. I think identity plays a role, but anti-Semitism is a hate ideology that existed for a long time, and it could develop over that time frame. It could develop tropes and ideas and forms of justification that exist in various milieus. So, and of course, you have within Jewish communities also Jewish people who express anti-Semitic stereotypes. I'm also, we need to think about, when I talk about 20% anti-Semitism in a particular context or in a thread, I'm not saying that these people are all anti-Semites. Germany is a very good example, France as well, that people express anti-Semitic ideas even unconsciously because it was just a cultural normal for a long time. So people sometimes express ideas that that they are not even aware of, and it doesn't matter who they are and how they position themselves towards the problem, and if they are part of the group they are just targeting. The stereotype itself is still there. It has its own dynamics. We are just the individuals who carry a hate ideology from generation to generation, but it creates its own forms, its own colors, and of course it can also occur within Jewish communities. It's the same thing about racism that can also come up in communities of people of color. It's something that is and like a hate ideology doesn't mean that people are always completely aware of that, and it follows its own dynamics. Also, with the claim of genocide, I think there are factual grounds that can say that this is a highly distortive picture. Here also it is important to understand what is actually happening right now in Gaza, what are the reasons for the current developments, and whether the claim of genocide, which is actually like the Nazi analogy, the reference to Nazi Germany is one of the worst things that you can say. There's the question of whether this is actually expressed also with regards to other scenarios that we are facing right now, and also in the last years, when you think of the civil war in Syria, for instance. So I think this is definitely important. The kind of double standard is an important aspect to identify anti-Semitism, not the only one, but I would say for every statement, it's important to evaluate, does it have a truth value? Is this actually really the case? Or is this just one of the many slogans that circulate in public discourse when it comes to Israel, and don't really help to understand the problem? And again, there are mistakes coming from the IDF. There are really horrible things happening. War is tragic. But is actually the reference to Nazi Germany, is the idea that there's a genocide happening in the Gaza Strip really suitable for what is actually happening right now? And is it actually something that through which we trivialize things that happened in the past? I think we have a language, we have a communication system called language, and we can use it in all ways. We can problematize. We can reject the current government in Israel, but if we just throw around these terms, I think they just lose their meaning at a certain point.
Thank you very much for that answer. I actually think that we're not going to be able to get to the online questions because we have to have a little break between our talks. So I want to conclude by thanking you so much for being with us and giving such in-depth responses to the questions. And I want to thank everybody who's with us, and thank you all for thinking deeply about the material that's being presented here. And I'm sure my colleague who asked you the question about the AI, should I put her? Okay, she just emailed you. So there you go. Her name is Erin McLeod, and you'll see an email from her. So maybe the two of you could be in touch directly.
Yeah, wonderful. Also for answering the remaining questions, right? And I really invite everyone to reach out. Also on our website, you have the contact details there. And if you want to be in touch, or if you want to hear more, or have a discussion about certain things, or come to other lectures where we can focus on specific elements in our analysis, or you want to have a copy of the lexicon I mentioned, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to be in touch.
Thank you so much, and have a good, I guess it's getting close to evening for you, so have a good night.
Thank you so much. Okay, thanks for having me. Bye-bye.